Some called it Judgment Day. Some called it Armageddon. It took a while before anyone called them zombies. We just didn't want to face the truth, I think. Murder happens all the time. Even vicious, brutal murders hardly rate a headline in the morning news these days. A few random murders, however grisly, didn't arouse real concern at first. As a society, we became largely inoculated against such brutality. Daily, it seemed, another child was taken, sometimes found raped, sometimes found murdered, and, more nefariously, some would claim, never found at all. We told ourselves that it happened somewhere else, that it happened to someone else. Never here. Not to us. But sometimes it did. Murder happens all the time. Even vicious, brutal murders hardly rate a headline in the morning news these days. A few random murders, however grisly, didn't arouse real concern at first. As a society, we became largely inoculated against such brutality. Daily, it seemed, another child was taken, sometimes found raped, sometimes found murdered, and, more nefariously some would claim, never found at all. We told ourselves that it had happened somewhere else. It happened to someone else. Never here. Not to us. But sometimes it did. It had become a backdrop in our waking lives. The milk carton kids had been replaced with walls of the missing in the vestibules of big box stores. Rarely did anyone pause to look, but for those with missing people, life was an excruciating exercise in stasis. Always waiting to hear of news or breaks in the case, unable to breathe and unable to move. But there was always hope. People clung to hope, against astronomical odds, that their loved ones would be found once again. After all, several children, some now even adults, had been recovered after a rescue or an escape. Their tales of captivity were dire, however. Who would argue that they would prefer never to know than to never have them back? But it gave false hope to millions, and prolonged the agony of the bereaved. Hanging on was sort of like living death in and of itself. Then the reports started coming in. It began as a trickle, but quickly grew into a flood of sightings coming into 911, America's most wanted call centers, police stations, radio stations. To anyone who would listen, this child or that young woman was spotted. I can't be sure, but it was definitely wearing the same clothes as the one on the posters, and it can't be him after all these years, but it looked just like him. Servers crashed and operators were overwhelmed, but there was widespread disbelief at first. But soon enough the evidence started to mount. It was impossible, it was incredible, but however you cut it, there was no denying that the missing people, mainly presumed dead from all over the world, had come back. People tried to approach him, but the zombies were unresponsive to discourse. So many missing people come back that the people took to calling them the return instead of zombies. They were the lost ones. The ones we hoped would be recovered alive, but never really believed that they would be. They had come back, but they weren't the same. They were filthy and lethargic. They didn't come or couldn't interact with others or their surroundings. They seemed to be disconnected from the world. None of them spoke, nor showed any recognition of those around them. In fact, they didn't seem to communicate in any way. They were unnerving with their catatonia. Although they seemed to have a destination in mind. Whether or not if they actually had a mind was debatable. Yes, they had come back, but they had seemed to have somewhere to go. For no placation or pleas of the living would stay them from their journey for long. They would eventually amble on, inexorably and unwavering, shuffling towards destinations unknown. Something had returned, but what those things were and what they wanted were a mystery. But they were not the people we knew. They were alien and alienated, foreign to our hearts, and they carried the odour of rot and decay about them. From the shallow graves and the swamps they rose. Some even clawed their way from cemeteries and churchyards, from vast fields to shuttered basements they came. Somehow they had become imbued with a powerful, unnatural will to seek out something or someone. It was truly terrifying to see them shuffling up the high road or down the lane, doggedly pressing on to untold destinations. And the first reports that they were killing people came in. These are unlike the zombies of cinema, however. These were not flesh-craved, slavering automatons, hungering endlessly for entrails and brains as envisioned by Romero, no. These returned had showed little interest of consuming those who they'd killed. Their main objective was clearly to kill. Yes, there were substantial evidence of ripping and tearing, but it was most likely the result of the returned only having their hands and teeth for weapons. There was no indication that they consumed who they killed. Mastications was a mean to an end. They did not, however, kill indiscriminately. They were very specific about those who lived and who died. Amongst those targeted by the returned were policemen, politicians, lawyers, teachers, movie stars, mechanics, and convicted pedophiles. They were from virtually every walk of life. They seemed to have shared no common denominator, although they were almost exclusively male. Many of the victims were pillar of the community types, but nothing seemed to connect them. It was a popular television host who put forth the first tentative guesses of what lay behind the mysteries of the returned, and those they selected to die. He knew the meaning of loss and tragedy better than nearly anyone, and it was he, with his dark adapted eyes, and who saw past the veneer and the legitimacy of these men and few women, and began to connect the dots. It was the icon of the missing, who ventured the first credible theory for the gruesome deaths that laid at the hands of the dead. His proclamation was met with a dubious reception. He was vindicated with little help from a young journalist and blogger who illegally accessed the National Criminal Database and obtained a list of the accused and convicted of sex crime suspects, and it was he who presented overwhelming evidence that the target of the return were most likely responsible for their murders. That's when panic ensued. Hordes of men swamped the police stations, confessing to unsolved or in some cases unknown murders, sometimes confessing to crimes in which someone else had been convicted of, confessing to anything they could think of, all with one stipulation: immediate remand. Jail had become the last refuge of the guilty. Prison seemed to be the only true safe place for the wicked. Even these safe havens began to fail. There were rumours that the guards didn't fight too hard to keep the return from gaining entrance, and there were a whisper or two of compliancy. After it was realised that the return weren't indiscriminate in their retribution, more and more of them accidentally made their way into the max sec wards. They gained entrance to the electronically locked cells as anyone's guess, although one fact is indisputable. Those tasked with the imprisonment of criminals may have also had friends and relatives who fell victims of evil, and were not necessarily opposed to a little vigilant justice being meted out on their behalf. In the beginning, there was fear, and panic, and mayhem, but once it became apparent that the returned were not attacking at random, indeed could not be provoked into violence even when savage themselves, we began to relax a little. As time passed, we simply grew accustomed to them. We began leaving our homes and shelters and going about our business as usual, even while they shuffled ever onward. I saw one cross the freeway once. Car drivers slowed it to allow it to pass. It just became part of the scenery. No more remarkable than a rock or a tree stump or a log. Injuring didn't work, shooting them didn't work. As long as they had a single arm or a leg left to which to drag themselves along with, they kept going. Patiently and emotionlessly, they just kept going. The old adage of getting them in the head was wrong. Some had clearly been killed via varying degrees of head trauma. Whatever force had reanimated them didn't seem to rely on the central nervous system or the intact cranium. I believe we began to relax a little because an image seen over and over will eventually lose its power to shock or alarm or even inspire notice. We relaxed because they seemed to be on a mission, and it was a mission of revenge, and we could all live with that. I think some people welcomed it. They were cleaning house, as it were, doing us what a proper democracy could never hope to accomplish. They were unerringly administering a biblical justice, an eye for an eye. I think we started to begin to feel safer. The most insidious threats to society were removed, and oftentimes invisible threats that shared our homes and our beds. One could walk the streets at night once again. The return were a better deterrent to crime than the death penalty. Pleading couldn't save you from their justice. Money couldn't save you from their justice. Yes, it was horrifying at first, but it was also satisfying. As far as we knew, they would never hurt an innocent person. They never made a mistake. But, of course, eventually all things must be interfered with by the government. The people in charge, if you will, began rounding them up. What became of them after that, I don't know. But there were many, and they just kept coming. That was when the wife of the television host died, killed on camera by the headless body of her young son. John took a gun from his own bodyguard and in the confusion ended his life with a resounding bang, and not a soul could blame him. Shock and outcries were immediate. Possible explanations were more elusive. Speculations ran wild. Why her? Had she been involved in her son's death? She had never even been seriously considered as a suspect. Nothing in the media ever pointed to her. And her grief and guilt had left in unattended were plaintive and wrenching. Their dramatic loss had played out across millions of televisions. I can't name a single person who would have questioned her innocence. Answers came soon enough. As more and more parents of the murdered children began to be taken by the returned, it had become clear that they also held those who failed to protect them just as responsible for those who had kidnapped and murdered them. When this unfathomable concept began to sink in, many parents of the murdered missing children even took their own lives. Their fates were sealed, convicted by their own hearts long before they could be silently accused by the returned. There was little fanfare, although there was great sympathy. Many others simply resigned themselves to the inevitable and waited their fates. They waited on lawn chairs and stoops and car bumpers and tire swings. They seemed to be everywhere. I never realized how many people had lost children. Having been tormented by their secret failures for decades in some cases, these parents grimly and stoically welcomed their wayward child's final toothy embrace. Across the lonely expanses of years, I've prayed she'd find her way home. I've hoped for it. I've dreaded for it, knowing most of the horrors the children are subjected to when kidnapped. I've berated myself and I've hated myself. I've blamed myself and I've blamed everyone else. I've made deals with God and I'd make deals with the devil if I thought he would keep his end. I've fantasized about it. I've mentally prepared feasts and homecomings and grave sites. I've imagined many scenarios, but this one that never occurred to me seems to fit the best somehow. It fits my guilt and my desire to be punished, you see. I sent her out to play that day because I was busy. I was busy with chores and cooking and laundry, busy with things that mattered not at all compared to her. The only thing that ever mattered was her, and I was too goddamn preoccupied to know it. As for me, I'll await my end in my old rocking chair. I've even left the kitchen door ajar for her. For my Ruth.